When the topic of economic recovery comes up, mainstream media often paints a picture of quote unquote bouncing back, like pressing reset after a storm. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll find a much more complex reality that isn't always reflected in headlines or sound bites. The media narrative usually emphasizes unemployment rates, stock market performance, or inflation figures. Now, while these indicators do matter, they're only part of a much bigger picture that is often missed or oversimplified. And in this video, we'll unpack what mainstream media got wrong about economic recovery, exploring what's really happening behind the scenes. We'll look at hidden factors affecting recovery, how economic gains are distributed, the social impact on everyday people, and whether our economies are truly back to normal or if the recovery was never really what it seemed. So let's start with the basics, GDP and stock market performance. So when the media reports that GDP is back on track or that the stock market has hit record highs, it often comes across as a sign of economic health. But GDP and the stock market tell us surprisingly little about the day-to-day lives of regular people. For example, GDP might be growing, but if that growth is driven by corporate profits, it may not actually reflect better wages or more stable jobs for the average worker. And the stock market, well, it represents only about 10% of American households directly, meaning most people aren't actually benefiting when the S&P 500 goes up. Case in point, during the COVID recovery, stock markets rebounded very quickly, even as millions of people were out of work or facing pay cuts. Media coverage of this rebound missed a key point. Wall Street's success was more about stimulus policies and low interest rates than actual recovery on Main Street. Now, when the media reports on unemployment rates, it's often framed as a black and white issue: unemployment is up or it's down. But there is a hidden dimension here too: the quality of jobs. During the recovery, many people returned to work, but they didn't necessarily return to the same quality of jobs. One underreported aspect is the rise of low-wage recovery. A large chunk of the jobs gained post-pandemic were in lower-wage sectors like retail and hospitality. Even now, some workers are finding it harder to regain previous income levels, benefits, or stability. The media's focus on the number of jobs misses these crucial details about wage stagnation and job insecurity, which have lasting effects on people's financial stability. And there's also the gig economy effect, and many who lost their jobs in traditional employment turn to freelance or gig work to make meets end. Now, while these roles helped bring down unemployment figures, they often lack job security, health benefits, and even retirement plans, factors that affect long-term economic health and stability. Another big media talking point: inflation. So for the past few years, headlines have sounded the alarm about rising prices, framing it as an isolated phenomenon. But inflation doesn't impact everyone equally, and not all inflation is bad. When prices rise due to supply chain issues or energy costs, that is one thing. But when companies raise prices to boost profit margins, consumers lose twice. They pay more while wages don't keep up. This kind of inflation, sometimes referred to as profit-driven inflation, became a huge issue during the COVID recovery, yet it is often lumped together with regular inflation in media reports, obscuring the reality of who benefits and who doesn't. Moreover, inflation coverage often neglects to consider housing and healthcare costs, which are major drivers of financial strain for many households. While we might hear about general price increases, housing affordability or rising medical expenses, which disproportionately affect lower income households, don't always get the spotlight. Now, mainstream media also tends to gloss over debt when talking about economic recovery. But debt, both personal and national, has been a massive part of the pandemic response, and it shapes the future of recovery more than we might think. Governments around the world borrowed at an unprecedented rate to fund stimulus packages, social benefits, and emergency responses. Now, while this was crucial to preventing economic collapse, it also leaves a question mark for the future. Nations now face mounting debt, and managing it may involve tax increases, cuts to social programs, or other measures that affect everyday people. On a personal level, debt has become a huge part of the quote unquote recovery story that isn't being told. Credit card debt, student loans, and housing costs have burdened individuals at a time when wages aren't rising fast enough to keep up. Many households that appear to have recovered are in reality balancing on debt, and this foundation is far from stable. And finally, economic recovery isn't just about numbers, it's about the quality of life. Mainstream media often doesn't cover how economic downturns and the subsequent recoveries affect people's mental health, family dynamics, or community well being. The pandemic exacerbated issues like mental health struggles, social isolation, and burnouts. And while we talk about getting back to normal, for many people, there is no true return to the pre crisis baseline. Economic growth without addressing social stability ultimately lacks resilience. And while economic data may suggest that things are improving, the actual well being of people remains a core issue. So, in conclusion, the mainstream media often simplifies economic recovery to digestible metrics like GDP growth and stock market surges, but the real story is far more complex. It's about job quality, wealth inequality, debt, inflation, and the social impacts of economic hardships. Without looking at these factors, we risk celebrating a recovery that only serves a few while leaving many behind.